And right now, I would like to introduce our first panelist, who is no stranger to St. Augustine, no stranger to you, quite a public figure these days, Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. She's a lecturer at the Institute of Gender and Development Studies. Her research areas of concentration include governance and politics, Caribbean feminisms, gender and women's studies, Indo-Caribbean gender and ethnic identities and sexualities. She's taught courses at the IGDS, including Introduction to Women's Studies, Feminist Frameworks, Men and Masculinities, Sex, Gender and Society, Gender, Ethnicity and Class in the Anglophone Caribbean. She's Associate Editor of the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies, which is part of the Making of Caribbean Feminism Research Project. She has a number of publications, amongst them Activism in Academia, 21st Century Caribbean Feminist Dilemmas, Feminist Review, 30th Anniversary Special Issue, 2012. She's also written on No Pure Place for Resistance, Reflections of Being Miss Mastana Bahar 2000. She was actually Miss Mastana Bahar 2000, so who says that academics can't be beautiful at the same time? She's also published Food, Family, Art and God, Aesthetic Authority in Public Life, in Anthropology and Individuals, and Insider Experiences and Ethnographic Knowledge, Reflections from Trinidad. So you see, we do have our in-house academic, Gabrielle Hosein. Gabrielle, welcome to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My job this morning is to really just provide some context for the discussions that the other panelists will raise. And this is based on the current project that the IGDS has, which is titled Politics, Power and Gender Justice in the Anglophone Caribbean, Women's Understandings of Politics, Experiences of Political Contestation, and Possibilities for Gender Transformation. So let's discuss some context. Women are still a minority in Caribbean parliaments as representatives, political party leaders, opposition leaders, and leaders of government. Indeed, the proportion of women in representative politics remains unreflective of the proportion of women in Caribbean electorates. For feminist scholars, the question of women in politics is twofold. First, creating greater gender equality in political leadership, the question of numbers, itself challenges long-established ceilings. However, crucially, advancing greater justice requires that women politicians additionally lead in ways that transform power, not just following, but setting a more democratic standard than men. The terrain for women's participation in politics is not a gender-neutral one. Women's progress must be understood in terms of how power and male privilege have guided the actions of the state and the thinking of women and men within democratic processes. For example, the media even has historically focused on traits over issues when discussing women candidates, even when women candidates receive equal or more media attention than men. And women in the parties and women's arms remain hemmed in by expectations that they will loyally toe a patriarchal line and defend rather than openly challenge more powerful men, either for office or on issues, especially gender equality issues, or for representation by women for women's rights. We can see this in the history of our own draft national gender policy, still not yet approved, the lack of much-needed sexual harassment policies in our political parties, and even the kinds of homophobia that result in the criminalization of same-sex practices amongst minors, as seen in the Children's Act of 2012. This means that while few women can penetrate upper echelons of male-dominated power, even that doesn't necessarily translate into wider challenges to male-dominated politics, nor greater space for larger and more diverse groups of women and men. Even in parties where positions for women are part of the structure, for example, the post of lady vice chair, to what extent can women advance higher than this glass ceiling? Without defending them, let me say that the regional research suggests that women politicians are in a tough predicament. On the one hand, they are held accountable by women's rights activists and groups of grassroots women who demand that female MPs do a better job of advancing women's rights and concerns. On the other hand, these women are negotiating the patriarchal terrain of their parties. Even in countries like Guyana, with a 1/3 electoral quota system, meaning that 1/3 of the representatives must be women, party discipline prevails. Women will not form formal caucuses aimed at pushing forward a women's agenda out of fear of being labeled too feminist or out of line, or out of fear of going against party ideologies. They are then viewed by women's rights activists as gender blind or undedicated to women's empowerment, and as facilitators of various injustices against grassroots women and men. So this is one tension. We cannot draw any direct correlation, I think, between women's political leadership and the passage of women-friendly legislation and policy outcomes. Where women's political leadership has been able to create such outcomes, there are other contexts, international conventions that are being followed through and so on, and also activism in the women's movement. It is also too simplistic to say, as people often do, that women in politics are merely puppets of male political powers or a cabal, being voiceless, loyal, and only submissive. Gender equality in our society makes things much more nuanced than that. As one respondent in our Guyana research said, you can be there and you can be present, but you have to be assertive, or else you can be used like a pack of cards. They shuffle you around, they tell you what to talk about and all of that. And it's a sad thing when you have women who are placed there to represent us, but they end up allowing themselves to be trampled upon. But why does this happen? What then are the scripts defining women's bids for leadership? And can women only enter when the leading man has completely lost credibility? Or can they challenge, as is their democratic right, without being seen as stepping out of place? Regional research suggests that women feel more pressure to prove their capabilities and competencies than men. Women may remain silent on issues and concerns related to women, perhaps out of fear of being excluded or ostracized from the party, or worse, ghettoized, or replaced by more loyal and disciplined women. Indeed, both men and women both believe that women enter politics aware of the disadvantages that come from gender biases, but they put up with these biases to prove that they can cope just the same as the men. Few women politicians therefore stand out or stand against and manage to survive to get to the top. Women climb political hierarchies primarily by being disciplined and loyal, often to male leadership. This then works against them when they have to prove their independence, build their own power base, or even be a renegade. Thus, while women politicians are not generally allowed to assert clear gender equality and women's rights politics, and by temperament or creed may not even wish to, it's still naive to see their challenges to historically male-dominated parties as entirely outside the long struggle to advance not only women's right to lead, but their responsibility to lead in ways that transform gender and other inequalities. We must also keep in mind that women, like all politicians, are not a homogeneous group and are not all focused on pursuing the same social issues, whether relating to women or not. They are differentiated from each other in terms of race, class, socioeconomic status, education, expertise, interests, and political party agendas. And they also have different relations with men in their parties and different notions of ideal gender relations in politics and in society. As feminists, we therefore continue to ask questions about what advancing women's political leadership and representation really means. Can women political leaders improve women's empowerment, protection from employment and wage discrimination, and overall socioeconomic position? Can they create greater gender-conscious political parties and parliaments? Following Eugene Barreto, Barbadian feminist scholar, my position would be that empowering women through political participation constitutes qualitative and quantitative change in Caribbean political systems and cultures. It places pressure on the value systems of our Caribbean states, and in so doing, problematizes the power vacuum that women still experience as citizens. But empowering women in politics must mean, more generally, creating more democratic, more participatory, and more just political and economic structures, not simply relying on individual women to squeeze through, proving, in fact, the general rule. U.S. Democratic politician Nancy Pelosi once stated that the word campaign is a war term. So when you go into a campaign, you prepare to go to war. If you think this is an exercise in civic activity, she said, then you are going to be surprised. This war, unquote, this war is inescapably shaped by notions of masculinity, femininity, and power. Even male politicians that I've interviewed argue that sexism makes it harder for women in politics, partly explaining why there are so few. Women candidates face the challenge of understanding this well, while having to avoid being cast as playing the gender card. What is this gender card? While covering the Chabonas West campaign last year, Jack Warner's trucks would blare Jack is the Man and Uncle Jack. These songs mobilize the respect, seniority, and authority seen as rightfully due to such paternal roles. Being the man additionally symbolized a macho figure of command and leadership, one to follow and admire. Only men can be the man. There's no equivalent for women, being the woman, mainly refers to sexiness, and woman is boss, or iron lady, returns us to women trumping men at a standard that they once and still set. When Jack plied the associations between power and manhood and attacked Khadija Amin's marital status and morality, no one saw these or him calling her, an adult woman, a girl, as playing the gender card. We think such resonance is inconsequential to elections, but in a world still overwhelmingly defined by male dominance and double standards, electoral wars are inescapably battles of the sexes too. Khadija's story parallels Kamal Prasad's recessive experience of the gender card. On platforms, the PM narrated how male leadership undermined her, put men before her, and called her a little girl from Siparia. But she turned stereotypically feminine virtues of patience, loyalty, and commitment into swords worthy of any vampire slayer. Have vampires to slay, of course. Khadija also had stories of being discouraged from leadership positions in the party in favor of more powerful men, but she obediently accepted to rise another day. This ideal of womanhood is strong, but not so independent that it will ever betray. And it's interesting to see these same images and discourses play out in the newspapers in the past weeks. The gender card is therefore littered all over campaign trails, showing how our ideas of masculinity and femininity organize meaning and access to status, resources, and power. When men play it, it is often invisible. When women call it out, they are accused of seeking unfair advantage. Therefore, while women's political leadership can be a successful strategy to advancing democratic governance, women's rights, and gender equality in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Anglophone Caribbean, feminist advocacy and action must continue to question the wider gender relations that shape women's access to power, women's ability to actually be transformational leaders, and in this way to transform the very structures, bureaucracies, and ideals which often work to keep them out of the highest tiers of political leadership in the first place.